So, welcome to today's Ento Live on the Pine Hoverfly and bringing it back from the brink of extinction. We're joined today by Dr. Helen Taylor, who is the Conservation Programme Manager at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. And she's going to be telling us all about this fantastic programme, the lessons they've learned, the challenges they've had, and what the future is for the conservation of the pine hoverfly. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Helen, and really excited to hear this talk.
Thanks very much, Kieran. Thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone for coming along. So my name is Helen Taylor, and I'm the Conservation Programme Manager at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. And I'm always very aware when I give talks like this that not everybody is super familiar with RZSS, or the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. So I think it's worth just giving you an introduction to who I work for. Often when I say RZSS, people look at me a bit blankly until I say, oh, we're the wildlife conservation charity that runs Edinburgh Zoo and Highland Wildlife Park, and they've usually heard of one of our zoos, which is great. So we do have those two zoos, but we also have a conservation department that currently employs about 20 people and looks after 23 different conservation projects around the world. And some of those projects are here in Scotland, and some of them are internationally in places like Brazil and Uganda. We also have the only zoo-based conservation genetics lab in the UK, our Wild Genes lab. And we do a lot of reintroduction programs, from big fluffy things like beavers and wildcats right down to partula snails and the pine hoverflies that I'm going to talk to you about today. So a really wide and varied conservation remit. And just to give you an idea of the geographical spread of where we're working, this shows you where the majority of our projects are based. So you can see that, yes, we're doing a lot of work here in Scotland, but we're also involved in collaborations with conservation projects all over the world as part of our strategy to reverse the decline of 50 species, at least 50 species, by 2030. And so today I'll be focusing on a native species project up here in Scotland, and it's an invertebrate project because that's what you guys are all here to hear about. And I probably don't need to show this slide to folks like you, but I'd just like to remind people why we're investing so heavily in invertebrate conservation at RZSS, because we don't just work on pine hoverfly, we work on other invertebrates as well. And as you're no doubt aware, invertebrates play these super key important roles in ecosystems, anything from pollination to waste recycling to important links in food webs, both as predator and prey. But unfortunately, as again, you're probably aware, insects are in trouble. And so here I switch to talking about insects, and I'm switching between insects and invertebrates. And it's because invertebrates is not a super helpful term when you're trying to talk about endangerment rates and interest rates, because obviously invertebrates involves everything from the flying squids that we saw last week, that was super interesting, right through to things like pine hoverfly, and those are not similar species in any way. So in terms of insects, people have measured declines in insects. 40% of insects are known to be at risk of extinction globally, which is not great. It's not great for biodiversity. It's also not great for us in terms of our food supplies, because a lot of our foods, like things like coffee and chocolate that we really like, and then more basic foodstuffs as well, they're all pollinated by invertebrates of one kind or another. So if insects are in trouble, then we're in trouble too. We know that 77% of all species known to science are invertebrates, so they're the most numerous group, most diverse group we have on the planet, but they receive very little conservation attention. So for example, in terms of reintroduction projects, like the kind of thing I'm going to talk to you about today, only 13% of recorded reintroduction projects have anything to do with invertebrates. So this is a group that are super important, that are in trouble, and that receive very little conservation attention. So that's why I'm really proud that we are having a focus on invertebrate conservation at RZSS. So to focus in on pine hoverflies, this is a species that you may not be particularly familiar with, and that's because it's super rare, and I'll come on to that in a second. So just to give you an idea of what these guys look like, they're perhaps not so much like the hoverfly you might picture in your head. When someone says hoverfly, you're probably thinking of a little black and yellow thing that you see in your garden hovering over flowers. These guys are fatter than that, but a little bit smaller than that. And the main differences between males and females is that males do not have a gap between their eyes, and the females do, but that's pretty hard to see when you're just looking at them to see who's who. So the most obvious difference is the fact that the males have more orange on their abdomen than the females do. And it's this pretty orange coloration that makes them quite a striking species to look at. They actually don't hover that much. We find that the pine hoverflies we have are quite lazy when it comes to hovering. Every now and again, you'll hear a little ee, and you're like, oh, they're doing it. And you look around and you see them doing it. But most of the time, they sort of fly pretty normal flight patterns and spend a lot of time crawling around on the floor as well. So hoverfly is not a great name for this species. So they are one of the UK's rarest invertebrates, and they are listed as critically endangered on the UK Red List. And they've always been confined to Scotland. Scotland is where they were first discovered. And Kieran, this is where we're going to come to our first poll question for people to see what people think. So if you can pop that up now, that would be great. Here we go. So what happened to the first pine hoverfly that was found in Scotland? And that is therefore the first pine hoverfly that was found in Britain as a whole. So did it fly away and it was never seen again? Was it swatted with a newspaper, or was it kept as a pet until it died?
Okay, yeah, so everything's anonymous. We don't know who's saying what, so please have a guess.
No judgments.
Yeah, I think for most of us, this is going to be a guess. I'm just going to give you a couple more seconds. Right, okay, there we go. We're going to end that there. So I have no idea. My guess, Helen, is that it flew away and was never seen again, because I'm imagining it was a photo, it was a recorder. So I'm not going with the majority. I'm going with the 34%. The majority, the 41%, have went swatted with a newspaper, and a quarter, so still a significant number, think it was kept as a pet until it passed away at a ripe old age. Well, so I'm dying to know the answer. What's the answer?
So the majority rules in this case, it was actually swatted with a newspaper. So and this is a bit of an apocryphal story, but the supposed incident is that pine hoverflies were discovered in Scotland by an entomologist who was taking a break over in Deeside in the Cairngorms, and he heard an annoying buzzing in his hotel room. And he wanted to get rid of that annoying noise. So he, as any good entomologist would, swatted the insect that was making the noise. And then when he looked at the now corpse of that insect, was like, ah, that's an interesting fly. I haven't seen anything like that before. And then actually managed to classify that as pine hoverfly, because pine hoverfly also exist across Europe, and they have quite a wide range across the Palearctic. So they're not just confined to Britain. So they were known before this, and the entomologist was able to identify that corpse, and that was the first record of pine hoverflies in Britain and in Scotland. And so they've always had a very restricted range. That was back in the 1800s, that first discovery, so relatively recent discovery in terms of species knowledge in Britain. And they have always had this sort of quite restricted range, just being known from the Cairngorms area in and around the Cairngorms. So these are all the locations recorded for pine hoverflies before 1980. You can see that post 1980, that distribution starts to get a little bit more restricted just into the Speyside side of the Cairngorms. And by present day, you're looking at one population of pine hoverflies in Britain. They're restricted to just one forest patch in the Cairngorms National Park. And that one forest patch is privately owned plantation forest. So you can imagine that's not an ideal situation from a conservation point of view. So this is a species in trouble. And obviously, when we've got species in trouble, we need to know a little bit more about them to understand what they need. So what do we know about pine hoverflies? Well, we know that the adults of the species are likely pollinators because they feed on particularly tree flowers like rowan. They really like rowan or rowan, however you want to say it. And we know that the larvae act as waste recyclers in the forest because of where they live. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. What they need, their ideal habitat, as far as we can tell, is mature, old growth pine forests. So big granny pine trees that get nice big rot holes in them. Again, that females need these to lay their eggs into. And they need a heart rot fungus, which I always struggle to produce, and I believe is pronounced Fallax sphenatsi, but I've forgive me, anybody who actually knows how to pronounce that Latin. They need this heart rot fungus that makes rot holes in these big old granny pines. And they also need rowan, lots and lots of rowan, because as far as we can tell, that is the adult's preferred food plant. So it's not enough for this species just to have a pine plantation forest with lots and lots of pine trees. They need big old growth pine trees, and it's not enough to just have pine. They need complexity in the forest. They need other kinds of plants, and they need a fungus to be present that's going to help their life cycle progress. So this is why we like to sort of harp on about the importance of complex old growth forest. There's not a lot of that left in Britain, even in Scotland right now. In terms of the life cycle, what these species are up to, so adult pine hoverflies, they only live for around 4 to 6 weeks. They're on the wing as an adult. Like most, or like many insects, pine hoverflies have multiple life stages. So the adults live for about 4 to 6 weeks, and they'll be out and about kind of June, July time, flying around, looking for somewhere. This is a female looking where to lay her eggs. And what she's looking for is a rot hole in an old pine tree that's filled up with rainwater, and that rainwater and pine sawdust mix that's in that rot hole is producing a sort of bacterial soup that her larvae are going to feed on as they grow. So that's what she's looking for. That's what the larvae need. The pine hoverfly then overwinter as larvae before pupating around sort of, they're going to start pupating kind of end of April into May. And then emerging again as adults in kind of June, July, looking for a mate and starting the whole thing over again. We don't see adult pine hoverfly in the wild very often. They're really hard to see. They spend most of their time high up in the canopy, we think, and they're quite small. So most of what we know about pine hoverfly in the wild comes from looking for their larvae. But there are several kinds of hoverfly that also use these kind of rot holes to rear their larvae in. So when we're doing a larval survey, we need to be able to tell the larvae apart. And we do have ways of doing that. And Kieran has another poll for you that's going to ask you how you think we identify pine hoverfly larvae from the larvae of other species. So what is the key identification feature for a pine hoverfly larvae? And it's one of the key identification features, I should say. So is it a beard, a mustache, or its eyebrows?
Yeah, and again, it's all anonymous. I failed miserably in the last one. Let's see if we can get this one right. And I can't tweak my answer to go with the majority because I've already told Helen in advance what I think, and she's not told me the answer yet. Right, I'm just going to give you another couple of seconds. Another couple of seconds, guys. Okay, right. Just showing the results. So we've got 21% have went for a beard, 41% for a mustache, 38% have went for its eyebrows. I've gone for a mustache based on the fact that I've heard of this before with other invertebrates, with other insects. So what is the correct answer, Helen?
So you get a point this round, Kieran. It is the mustache, and I can show you what this looks like, what we mean when we say a mustache. So this is a pine hoverfly larva. We would say one of the world's cutest larvae. They also get referred to as rat-tailed maggots, but we don't like to use that name because it's not very flattering. But what that refers to is, if you look at this picture of a larvae just here in this corner here, the top right picture, you can see this sort of tail coming off the back of it. That's its so-called rat tail. It's not actually a tail, it's a breathing tube that the larvae use, and it's on a sort of like it's telescopic, it's extendable. So if they're really deep down in the pine mulch, they can extend that tail all the way up to the surface so that they can breathe. And then they can draw it in again when they need to. So that's their breathing tube. But yes, this is the face of a pine hoverfly larvae. And it's a little bit deceptive because the reason it looks like a face is because it's got these two what look like eyes here at the front. But these are not eyes. These are actually another couple of breathing apparatus called spiracles, but they make it look like eyes with a mustache. And the mustache is made up of these bristles on its face, and they're like bristly hooks that they use to sieve bacteria and microbes out of the soup that they're feeding from. So it's a feeding apparatus. And the other identification features I gave you in the quiz are ones that we use to identify other species of hoverfly larvae. So they all do have these crazy features. So there's another species called Myothropa florea that has more of a sort of beard and mustache going on. There's more of a lumberjack aesthetic, similar to what you're sporting yourself there, Kieran, actually. And then we have another species called Calicera rufa, which has these sort of really very expressive, like eyebrows, for want of a better word. Again, these are over its spiracles, not over its eyes, but they give it this very expressive sort of so-called face. But we like to think of our pine hoverfly larvae as the mustachioed gentlemen of the hoverfly world because of their lovely, lovely wee mustaches. And we think they're very, very cute. So we're trying to give them a bit of a PR job away from the rat-tailed maggot brand. And they show some amazing adaptations because this species overwinters as a larvae. They live in the Cairngorms in Scotland. It gets pretty cold up there in winter, and so they have to be able to freeze thaw. So this is one of the jars that we keep our larvae in pine sawdust mulch. And this is from a few years ago now, when the jars froze for the first time. So this is the sort of glass is broken away from the outside of the jar, and what you're left with is this sort of like pine popsicle with frozen moss in the top with a load of frozen larvae inside it. And obviously the first time this happened, when we were first trying to breed the species, we were all a little bit worried about it because we didn't know if this was normal and what they were going to do. And then they all thawed out and they all pupated and they went through to adults as normal. And now we know that our larvae spend a lot of time sort of freeze thawing, and we don't tend to worry about it anymore. We're a bit more relaxed about it. We don't know what mechanism they're using to do this freeze thaw behavior. And it is a super interesting adaptation, but it's not uncommon in invertebrates and other species to be able to overwinter in this manner. So they are pretty cool as larvae. So why is this species so rare? Well, I've explained the kind of habitat they need and this desperate need for rot holes and for food. And like I said, that habitat has massively disappeared in Britain over the past few hundred years, and even in Scotland, where we do still have some of the larger fragments of forest and the only fragments of Caledonian pine forest, these are still really depleted, and they are fragments rather than continuous forest blocks. And this is a real problem for pine hoverfly. So one of the really important bits of work that's been going on is habitat restoration. And it's important to state that the pine hoverfly breeding program is not something that we do in isolation. This is something that we work with partners on. We are part of the Rare Invertebrates in the Cairngorms partnership, which also involves the RSPB, Cairngorms National Park Authority, Buglife, Butterfly Conservation Scotland, and Nature Scot. We work in tandem with landowners like Forestry and Land Scotland. And a lot of the original information on pine hoverfly was also discovered back in the day by the Fallax Society, particularly Graham and Ellie Rothray and Ian McGowan working on that as well. So this is very much a group effort. But while that habitat restoration is going on in the wild, and that involves fencing off parts of forests to stop deer getting in and browsing back rowan to make sure rowan's coming through and producing that complex forest, and also creating artificial rot holes in areas where rot holes have not developed. So using a chainsaw to take trees that were going to be felled as part of forest management anyway, and then cutting holes in stumps or felled trunks to create holes and troughs for us to release larvae into. So while that's all going on in the wild, that's fantastic. And we need that habitat, but we also need flies to put back into that habitat. And the numbers of pine hoverflies in the wild are so low and their dispersal ability is so small, they can't fly very far. What they need really is more flies in more places. And that is where RZSS comes in with the pine hoverfly breeding program. So our task is to breed as many pine hoverflies as possible so that we can put them back out into all of these newly created habitat areas that we're hoping are going to be really good for this species. And so to breed pine hoverflies in captivity, what we need to do is mimic these habitat requirements that they have in the wild. And we do that using all of our husbandry knowledge. And so this just shows you how it's the life cycle again, but it's how we replicate the life cycle in our facilities at Highland Wildlife Park. So for the larval stage, for example, I told you they need these rot holes in pine trees. We mimic the rot holes using jars, and we fill those jars with pine sawdust mulch and rainwater. We fill them up with rainwater, and we put the larvae in there. We put a moss plug in the top of the jar so that when the larvae is getting ready to pupate, it can crawl out into the moss and turn into a pupa. When they are pupating, we take that moss plug out and we pop it into an empty hummus pot. So there's no expense spared for our guys. It's jam jars and hummus pots all the way. And then once that pupa has gone through its pupation phase and the adult has emerged, the adults are put into specially designed flight cages with all the food plants that they might need, places to perch, special lighting to keep them warm, and they're put in there in pairs in the hope that they will mate up. Each flight cage has an egg-laying pot provided to it, which again is filled with sawdust and rainwater, and that means that the female can lay her eggs whenever she feels like it, and hopefully in that way we get the most eggs possible each season. So this is something we've been working on for a while. We were first asked to breed pine hoverfly in 2015, and we started off doing that at Edinburgh Zoo, but it wasn't working too well. So we moved the project up to Highland Wildlife Park with the hope that it being closer to the natural habitat for the species, the conditions would be better. And this turned out to be quite right. In 2019, the keepers at the park took pine hoverflies through a complete breeding cycle for the first time, which was a massive achievement. And from that base, we've grown the project from strength to strength. So by 2020, we started with 25 larvae that had been brought in from the wild. And we then grew the population up to 170 larvae within a couple of years. And from that 170, we had a record-breaking season in 2021 where we produced 8,000 larvae. So we're looking at really big numbers here. And this is just to give you an idea of what that sort of growth looks like. So this is going from 2019, where we only had a handful of larvae, into 2020, where we had 170, and we were like, okay, we're going to need a bigger shed, we're going to need better facilities. We're working in a tiny tumble down shed at Highland Wildlife Park, and it's testament to the hard work of the keepers working on this that they managed to keep it going in the way they did. So we got ourselves some funding and we got a big shed, a much bigger shed. It gave us way more space, but it also gave us more climate control and ability to look after the flies in the way that we wanted to, and in the numbers that we needed to, with 120 larvae pupating through to adults. And this is just to give you an idea of what it looks like inside the shed during breeding season. This is all set up for adults. We've got all the cages there. We've got the lighting. This is Carl here. I'll introduce you to Carl and the rest of the team in a minute. Carl's very tall. I'm very small. And so yeah, that's what it looks like. And in summer, when all the adults are out, it really is an incredible place to be. It's extremely warm. We keep it very warm so the flies have lots of energy for mating and producing. It smells of wonderful flowers. There's flowers everywhere. It's been described to me as being a bit like a bridal chamber, and you can just hear the noise of all these adults buzzing around, and this adult form that almost no one ever gets to see, and we're just surrounded by them, which is such a privilege. So yeah, 8,000 larvae. This is what that looks like when you breed 8,000 larvae. Each of these jars has around 20 larvae in. And so obviously that's a lot of jars, that's a lot of larvae. We can't rear all of those larvae through to adulthood and look after them all. And so at that point, it really is time to do some releases. And that's fantastic, because that was always the aim of the project, was to breed enough pine hoverfly larvae to be able to release them. And we do release them at the larval stage, because that means that we can put them out into those pre-prepared artificial rot holes that our partners have been making out in the wild sites. So we chose 3 sites for our releases, and it's actually really hard to find sites still with the kind of habitat that we think pine hoverfly needs. So we managed to find 3 places that had the right mix of pine, rowan, and we're in kind of the right locations. And these sites are reasonably far apart from one another. The distances are far further than a pine hoverfly could fly, but because of the kind of restoration work that's happening in those areas, there is a possibility that over time these areas could become a lot more joined up. So in terms of long-term planning, we're hopeful that these areas could eventually become connected, which would be really exciting if we have successful releases. In terms of when we do the releases, it's very much a 3-stage process. So we do 2 rounds of larval releases, one in October and one in March. And the reason we do this twice is because we know that most invertebrates, including pine hoverfly, can be quite sensitive to climatic events. So if there's a super cold snap or a warm snap, or there's too much rain or there's not enough rain, that could really decimate some of the larvae that we've put out there already. And so doing it in 2 waves like that gives us kind of 2 goes at it. And it also allows us, for the larvae that are kept in our facility until March, we've given them more of a head start in terms of keeping them in a very safe, sheltered environment where we know they've got plenty of food. We release them with the sawdust in the jar, so they're going in with their bacterial soup, ready to seed that new trough or hole with that soup. And then any larvae that aren't released, we take them through to adulthood for our breeding population. We'll typically take around 300 larvae through pupation and into adulthood. And the reason we do that is because we can only actually house about 150, but we need to make sure we get the right numbers of males and females and that we get the right genetic mix as well. We're trying really, really hard to minimize the amount of mating between relatives or inbreeding that we have in our conservation breeding population. And so we need like the right numbers of individuals from different genetic lines in order to mix and match as best we can. We're always going to be dealing with a really low amount of genetic diversity in this species just because the numbers became so small in Britain, but we want to make the best of that as we can with the tools we have. So we take 300 through to pupation, and then any that don't make it into the breeding population because we already have too many of that sex or too many of that genetic line, we then release as adults in June into one of our release sites and give them a chance to mate and reproduce in the wild as well. So we have done 1.5 rounds of releases so far, but for our first round of releases that took place in October 21 and March 2022, how many larvae do you think we released? And Kieran has a poll to help me answer that question. So how many pine hoverfly larvae did we release across October 2021 and March 2022? Was it 3,000, 6,000 or 9,000? And if your maths is decent, from what I've just told you, you should be able to figure it out.
Yeah, my prediction was correct about how people would vote, Helen.
Yes.
I always predict on the numbers ones that people quite often go for the middle number. Right, most of you have voted, so I'm going to end that poll and share the answers. So the options we gave were 3,000, 6,000 and 9,000. And yeah, majority is 6,000 with 56%. And about a quarter have said 9,000 and the rest have said 3,000. Now, before I'd heard anything in the talk, my guess was 9,000 because I thought Helen was going to try and wow us with the numbers. It would be the highest. But that was before I'd heard the process beforehand. So what's the answer, Helen?
Well, you're going to be really disappointed because Kieran said to me before this talk, he's like, I hate it when they make it the middle number as the answer. And I was like, oh no, because it is the middle number. We released about 6,000 pine hoverfly in our first round of releases. Obviously, the numbers are not super precise just because of the vast quantities of larvae that we're dealing with and the fact that we don't want to disturb them too much at release. But yes, it is 6,000, which I think is still a wow number, Kieran, even if it's not 9,000.
I agree, but it would be even more of a wow number if the other options were 2,200.
Yeah, okay, you can go back on mute now. So yeah, that's the release process. That's how many we released. And so this is what this looks like when we do a pine hoverfly release. And I've been really keen to get as much sort of media attention for this project as possible, because as I'm sure you're aware, invertebrates tend to be a bit overlooked by the press and the media. We've actually done really well in generating interest around pine hoverfly, which we've been really pleased about and has been fantastic. So we've had them on the BBC, all kinds of things like that. And I'm going to play a video now just to show you what a pine hoverfly release looks like. There's no sound on this video, so don't worry if you can't hear anything. I'm just going to talk over it. So this is me and my colleague Carl Allott out in part of Abernethy Forest, which is an RSPB reserve. And that's the thing I should have said about the 3 release sites we've chosen. They're all managed by conservation organisations. So RSPB managed 2 of the sites, Forestry and Land Scotland managed the other one. So then we know they're being managed for conservation purposes, and we know that they should be safe for the species in perpetuity, as opposed to a private plantation site. So this is basically us with our partners and collaborators releasing pine hoverfly. You can see it's not a particularly delicate task. It's not like you open the door and the larvae just emerge. You know, it's kind of like banging out a bottle of ketchup into a pre-prepared trough or hole. We are, you know, reasonably careful with the guys, but we do have to get the sawdust out of there as well. And so this is how they all get released into their new homes. And you can see the jars there with the moss plugs on. We're also recording the GPS locations of all the troughs and stumps that we released into, so that we can check them again as part of our post-release monitoring program, and checking how many larvae were released into each hole. And once the release is done, we cover the top with some moss, so that just like in the jars, they've got moss to crawl out and pupate under. And then we put a lid on just to protect them from any kind of predators or prying eyes. And then that's us done. So it's perhaps a little bit more low key than releasing a big mammal or a flock of birds where you open a box and they all fly out, but we do get to go to some spectacular locations. As you can see here, the Cairngorms is a fantastic place to work, and we're very, very fortunate. And some of the places we go are quite inaccessible, which is why we're out there in our 4x4 vehicles. So that is what a pine hoverfly release looks like. And it's not just enough to release these animals, we also need to know if we've been successful. And so we were really, really excited last year. Like I said, pine hoverfly adults are really hard to see in the wild. Before we started this project, no one had seen a pine hoverfly in the wild, an adult pine hoverfly in the wild for over 8 years. And in July 2021, after we did our first round of releases, an adult pine hoverfly was spotted in the wild by one of our collaborators. And we knew it must be from one of the larvae that we had released because it was in one of the release sites, and there weren't any pine hoverfly in those release sites before we did the releases. So that was super exciting to see. However, having adults flying around is not enough. We also need those adults to be there in high enough numbers that they're able to find each other and mate and produce more larvae. So a really important thing that we did was a larval survey follow-up, which was carried out in September 2022. And this was even more exciting because here we found proof that our released animals had bred in the wild. We found pine hoverfly larvae in holes and stumps where we hadn't released any larvae previously, so they definitely couldn't have been last year's larvae. Pine hoverfly larvae can sometimes go through 2 years as a larva, so it can be difficult to tell if something you're seeing is a new larvae from this year or an old larva from the year before. But we found larvae in holes that we had not released larvae into, and therefore they must be new. They must have been laid by adults that had emerged from the larvae that we released. So this was super, super exciting and shows that the animals we released did breed last year. But again, that's still not enough. 1 year's breeding success is not enough. We know that from other reintroduction attempts, both with this species and others. We need consistent reproductive success, and we need these populations to become self-sustaining to the point where we're not having to help them all the time. And to do that, we're playing a bit of a numbers game at the moment by doing more releases. So we managed to breed another 8,000 pine hoverfly this year. We're doing that quite consistently now, which is really nice to see, touch wood. And so in October last year, we did another round of releases, 3,000 larvae across those same 3 sites. And we will be doing our next releases in April in just a couple of weeks as well. And you can see my team members, Carl and Adam here, very excited to be out there releasing larvae with us. And the reason we're doing these releases in April instead of March is because we had a particularly cold March up in the Cairngorms this year, and all the larvae froze on the week that we were supposed to be doing the releases. And it's really, really hard to release tiny frozen larvae into frozen rot holes. So we decided to delay the release until April, when we knew that they would all have thawed out. So we'll be doing that in a couple of weeks' time. And like I said, this is Carl and Adam, who work on my team up at Highland Wildlife Park, and they're both incredibly, they're instrumental to the work that we do. I could not do this project without those guys. And I'm lucky to have a really awesome team of people who work on this project and the other invertebrate projects that we work on at Highland Wildlife Park. So Carl over there, Carl Allott on the left, Adam Button on the far right. And then you've got myself in the middle with Kasia Ruta, who's also on our team and who leads on our pond mud snail conservation breeding program here at Edinburgh Zoo. You've got Genevieve Tompkins down the bottom there, who's the project officer for the Rare Invertebrates in the Cairngorms project, who has been incredibly important to the success of all of this invertebrate work. And Adam, excitingly, is also working on our newest invertebrate project, which is our work with dark-bordered beauty moths, which I don't have time to talk about today, but if Kieran wants to invite me back next year, then I'll probably be able to talk about that species and the work that we're doing with those guys as well. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of where we're at with our pine hoverfly breeding program and the successes and challenges we've had to date. And I think we've got time for questions. I'm more than happy to stay on and chat to people about anything else they might want to know about this project or any of the other projects that we're running at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. And thank you so much for coming.